Start with a little history. Back in 2002, over 20 years ago, this committee held a hearing on bipartisan legislation entitled the Unaccompanied Alien Children Protection Act. It was introduced by our colleague, Senator Dianne Feinstein, along with Republican Senator from Kansas, Sam Brownback. The bill was a response to a bipartisan concern that unaccompanied children seeking safe haven in the United States were being deported back to countries where they were not safe and where they might be persecuted. 6 years of debate followed on this issue. And in 2008, listen carefully, the Senate unanimously passed the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, TVPRA. That bill included the Unaccompanied Alien Child Protection Act. It was signed into law, listen again, by President George W. Bush. Sadly, since then, the immigration debate has devolved into a much more partisan issue, and often then vulnerable children are the victims of that political battle. During the Obama administration, some Republicans falsely claimed that the DACA program, which the president initiated at my urging, to protect dreamers for deportation, was the reason that unaccompanied children were fleeing to our border. I've heard that argument made by one senator on the floor repeatedly. When the Trump administration began and unaccompanied children were still coming, some Republicans claimed the TVPRA of 2008 was really to blame. They're ignoring the obvious. The world was and still is in the midst of the worst refugee crisis in modern history. And we used to believe a bipartisan approach to this would have a moral and legal responsibility created to protect vulnerable children who are fleeing persecution. We've received about 10 or 12,000 migrant children in the city of Chicago sent to us from the governor of Texas and other Republican leaders in states. I've made a point of trying to meet some of these people and understand what led them to this desperate situation. It's heartbreaking. It was just less than 2 weeks ago that I was at a Piotrowski Park shelter in the city of Chicago and met with 50 or 60 of these mothers and their kids. The kids are little kids who have made this death-defying journey to the United States. And you think to yourself, who in their right mind, what parent in their right mind would subject their kids to the danger of that journey? How desperate they would be to have that happen. And you see it over and over again. They felt that they couldn't feed their children or the children couldn't exist in a safe way in their countries any longer, and they were prepared to risk their lives and the lives of their children to make the journey. This is an issue that should transcend politics. So I tried to be consistent in my oversight efforts, whether the president was Republican or Democrat. I vigorously opposed President Trump's inhumane family separation policy, and I immediately raised concerns following recent reports that unaccompanied children were being exploited. Ranking Member Graham and Immigration Subcommittee Ranking Member Cornyn, along with other Republican members of the committee, sent a letter asking me to hold this hearing. As I told them in response, I would accommodate this request because I was already working with Immigration Subcommittee Chair Padilla on today's hearing. I also asked Senators Padilla, Graham, and Cornyn to join me in a document request to the Department of Health and Human Services to learn more about what went wrong and how to fix it. What we must not do is weaken the TVPRA and make it easier to deport unaccompanied children back into harm's way. Our laws require that these children are screened for human trafficking, housed in child-appropriate settings, reunified with any family in the United States while they await their immigration proceedings. But the tragedy is that these children are still at risk. Migrant children have been forced to work long hours in extremely dangerous conditions, from meatpacking plants and slaughterhouses, for example. Well, many, many years ago, when I was in college, I worked my way through college 4 straight summers in a slaughterhouse in East St. Louis, Illinois. I can tell you from my personal observation, it is no place for a child. They could easily lose a limb or their life in this dangerous environment. Since 2018, our nation has seen a nearly 70% increase in illegally employed children. Earlier this year, I demanded the Department of Labor and Health and Human Services do more to protect these kids. Both have made some progress, but not enough. And let's not forget our responsibility on this side of the table. It's no secret that employers throughout our country are struggling to find workers. Some states, like Arkansas, actually loosen child labor laws in the hopes of addressing workforce needs. Let's consider another approach. Let's reform our immigration laws and allow adults to meet workforce needs instead of exploiting children fleeing abuse. I hope today's hearing will be an opportunity to revive the bipartisan spirit of many years ago and discuss how to protect unaccompanied children who are frightened and traumatized. With that, I hand off to the ranking member, Senator Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you having the hearing. I think this hearing will illustrate the differences between our side and yours about a problem we have in common. Nobody wants unaccompanied children to be abused, to be put in labor environments that are unhealthy. Bottom line is the policies of this administration, Mr. Chairman, are not working. In FY 2022, there were 33,239 unaccompanied minor encounters at our border. In FY 22, 2 years later, it's 152,057. There's been a 357% increase regarding unaccompanied minors at our border. Have you ever asked what happened? You should. We all want children to be well taken care of, but have you ever asked the question, what is it in the last 2 years that's driven the numbers up 357%? It's policy. The Biden administration has a policy that if you're an unaccompanied child, not from Canada or Mexico, you will not be sent back to the country of origin. In FY 2022, the average age of an unaccompanied minor was around 14, 64% were boys. The countries of origin, 47% from Honduras, 29% from El Salvador, and others 11%. Guatemala 47%, Honduras 29%, El Salvador 13%. These three countries make up the bulk of unaccompanied minor encounters at the border. Now, why is that? If you're an unaccompanied minor from that country, you're not sent back, and people know it. You're located in the United States at taxpayer expense. You're enticing more, not less. Here's a solution. Have a consistent policy. Send children back to their home country, even if they're not from Mexico or Canada. This will stop overnight. The journey to get here is hell on earth. Only God knows what happens to young girls in particular. So the reason we wanted this hearing is to highlight the problem and ask the Biden administration to consider changing policy. They have changed policy regarding post-Title 42. We're down to 3,500 a day, and we're celebrating that. But that's better than 10,000 a day. So, Mr. Chairman, the answer to why there's been a 357% increase in unaccompanied minors is policy. I'd love to work with you, but there's nothing we can do until you change your policy. The three countries I just named have figured out that if you can get an unaccompanied minor here in the United States, they never leave. Bottom line is, the Flores decision is also incentivized the use of children. If you come as a family unit, we can't detain a child, then the family most likely is released in the United States. We've created a demand for human smugglers to get children involved in the smuggling process, because if you can get a child, whether it's a family member or not, you claim it to be a family, then the chance of you being deported has gone way down. So we have incentivized the use of children in illegal immigration, and nothing will change until we change our policy. This idea of a family unit, it's obvious to me that more and more people in the human trafficking business, smuggling, have figured out that if you can get a minor child, not an unaccompanied adult male, in the mix, the chance of the unit staying in the United States goes exponentially up. So as we talk about the abuse, we all agree is bad. We'd like it to stop. In terms of hiring children illegally, count me in stopping that. But the reason we wanted this hearing is to try to persuade our friends on the other side that the policy choices of the Biden administration are creating an unending flow of children to this country. The idea of having a child in a family unit, whether they're family or not, the incentives for the smugglers to use children is through the roof. And we're now seeing children be recycled that came here, released in the United States, sent back to the country of origin, and the smugglers use them yet again. You're never going to break this cycle until you change policy. And there'll never be an immigration deal that codifies this strategy. So a good faith step in fixing our immigration problems is to change policy regarding unaccompanied minors. It's in the minor child's interest, and it's in our national security interest, and it's in our interest as a nation. This needs to change and stop, and a 357% increase in the last 2 years is going to continue in perpetuity until we change policy.
Senator Graham, as you often say, count me in. I hope you understand I mean it. You and I have worked on this issue for how long, I don't know, more than 10 years. And we've tried to find bipartisan solutions, sometimes angering people on our own parties in the process. I met last week with Congresswoman Veronica Escobar from El Paso, who is working on a bipartisan approach in the House. I hope we can talk to her and talk about policy changes on a bipartisan basis. Happy to introduce now Senator Padilla, Chairman of the Immigration Subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Grassley, and Mr. Chairman, also for the opportunity to co-chair this hearing focused on not just protecting unaccompanied children, but also taking up the mantle in the fight against child labor exploitation. One of the dark sides of our nation's history that sadly we continue to fight today. Now, every day in America, colleagues, every day in our United States of America, school-aged children wake up and get ready for their day. But instead of putting on their tennis shoes and their backpacks in cities and towns across the country, too many of them are putting on steel-toed boots and work belts. And they're preparing to climb roofs, operate hazardous machinery, brave scalding hot kitchens in conditions that most Americans thought were outlawed long ago. These children wake up before the sun comes up to find day labor jobs or work in hazardous conditions overnight in slaughterhouses. These are no exaggerations. I think most Americans would be right to think that Congress has already acted to prevent kids from working dangerous jobs for a long number of hours. But because of the dire financial needs of their families back home, coupled with the disastrous immigration policies of the prior administration and a repeated willingness of corporations to turn a blind eye, more and more unaccompanied immigrant children are slipping through the cracks. Since 2018, just the last 5 years, since 2018, the Labor Department has seen an increase of 69% in children found to be employed illegally. In some instances, that's meant kids as young as 12 having to fight tired eyes during their school day, only to go from there to work a night shift in a job. For others, it's meant missing school entirely, whether it's to put in more hours, to send more money back home to their families, or just to pay their expenses and survive here in America. As we will hear today from our witnesses, there are a few contributing factors that enable this fundamental moral failure to play out. While there have been some failures along the way to properly vet sponsors, most, if not all, children placed with sponsors could benefit from post-release services, especially for vulnerable minors after they are released. But we can't ignore the root of this problem. The reality is that this problem is another direct result of our broken immigration system. During the Trump administration, our immigration system became so restrictive that families could not come to our border to apply for asylum together. This forced parents to send their kids alone so at least they could escape to find safety. And because of that policy, the kids who made it here are being put in heartbreaking positions that they likely wouldn't be in had their parents been able to lawfully seek asylum with them, as our laws allow. And so, yes, there is a larger context to consider here. Too often I hear my Republican colleagues complain about border security, but refuse to take up or vote for meaningful reforms to our immigration laws that enjoy bipartisan support. And somehow they're shocked when they learn of migrant children working long hours, overnight in hazardous conditions, or they limit the labor shortage without working to tap into the enormous pool of labor available to us that's historically been available to us through existing visa programs and other areas of our immigration system. Now, privately, I hear a lot of support for modernizing our immigration laws and how it would be great for business, how it would be great for their local economy, their state's economy, our national economy. But they withhold their support for expanding legal pathways for migrants to come here and help boost our economy. So we have to acknowledge the totality of this problem if we are to work together to update our outdated immigration system. And Mr. Chair, count me in as well. But on top of that, as we've learned from multiple exposés over just the last several months, there is a pattern of willful ignorance that exists in America. It would be misleading to say that this exploitation was happening entirely in the shadows. The major corporations who benefit from this exploitation seem more than happy to turn the lights off, close the door, and count their profits. And often when we learn of child labor violations, we hear excuses by ownership, passing the buck to subsidiaries and contractors. We hear corporate value statements reiterating zero-tolerance policies. But those policies have become hard to take seriously when they're repeatedly issued for damage control. They fall flat when the dust settles. In April of this year, Senator Hickenlooper and I wrote to 27 CEOs of major U.S. companies asking about their compliance with child labor laws. And here's what we heard back. Well-written, carefully worded responses, but not much accountability. So that's not enough for me, because if the very companies who are employing these children, dozens of hours each week, aren't willing to take ownership of their shortcomings, then nothing will change. Yes, we have the laws on the books already, but now we need to support the Department of Labor and the Department of Justice in doing their work to enforce the law and hold employers accountable. So I'm looking to hearing more from our witnesses on just how dire conditions are for these children in reality today in the United States of America, and what they see as a path forward to protect them, protecting children who should have never been in those circumstances to begin with. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Padilla, and I want to recognize a senior senator from Texas, Senator Cornyn, who is the ranking member of the Immigration Subcommittee. Senator Cornyn.
Thank you, Chairman Durbin, for calling this hearing today. In response to the letter we wrote on April the 27th, we mentioned in the letter that the first major indication of a problem with regard to what's happening to these children appeared in a Bloomberg story in 2021, which reported a federal law enforcement investigation in which the Health and Human Services had released dozens of these children to the same sponsor, who exploited them for labor in the poultry processing and similar industries. And then next year, Reuters reported that dozens of children had simply disappeared in the Houston area and that the Houston Police Department was struggling to try to locate them. And then earlier this year, the New York Times dropped two major investigative bombshell stories exposing widespread exploitation of unaccompanied children. We're talking about 13, 14, 15-year-old kids forced to work in meatpacking plants and food manufacturing facilities. Worse, the New York Times illustrated that senior Biden administration officials like Secretary of Health and Human Services Xavier Becerra knew about this and continued to move children out of Health and Human Services as fast as possible by loosening vetting requirements for sponsors. Two former officials were also aware of this scandal and that these children were being exploited on a major scale. That includes Labor Secretary Marty Walsh and White House Domestic Policy Advisor Susan Rice. To get to the bottom of this, my colleagues and I on this side requested the chairman to bring these high-level government officials in to get their explanation for what happened. And I'm disappointed that they could not be troubled to appear here today. The truth is they don't care. President Biden does not care about the fate of 300,000 plus unaccompanied children that have been placed with sponsors in the United States since he became president. President Biden and his administration can't tell you where these children are. His administration can't tell you what they are doing, what is being done to them, whether they're being exploited for labor, whether they're being sex trafficked, whether they're being abused or neglected. They simply don't care. Because if they did care, they would do something different. So while I appreciate the appearance of every witness here today, the truth is that nobody here today can shed light on the administration's policies and why they just simply decided to loosen vetting requirements. This is particularly relevant since last week the Office of Refugee Resettlement at Health and Human Services published the results of its self-audit, grading its own papers. And guess what? They gave themselves an A. They said, no problem, everything's all right, and that they had adhered to their own loosened vetting requirements and placement processes for sponsors. But this claim is laughable. It would be laughable if it wasn't so sad, if it didn't make you angry, especially given the reporting in the New York Times, which based on HHS's own data shows a massive increase in reports of abuse and neglect just months after President Biden came into office. This chart, which I believe appeared in the New York Times story, shows that in 2018, the number of calls, reports of trafficking and abuse of migrant children, and you can see for yourself what happened since the time President Biden came into office. Those numbers are skyrocketing. But the truth is, these are just the ones that people called in about or complained about. Where are the other 300,000 children? They can't tell you, and they don't care. Well, taking a step back, the UAC, unaccompanied alien children crisis, is a symptom of a larger problem. Basically, that the Biden administration has, through its policies, fomented a crisis on the border by creating pull factors. They let you know ahead of time, if you make it to the border under certain circumstances, you are going to be welcomed into the interior of the United States, never to be heard from again. Because only 12% of the people who actually show up for an asylum hearing actually qualify. But the transnational criminal organizations, the coyotes, the criminals who profit from this, they know that as long as they can continue to move people across the border into the United States, that the Biden administration will not care, will not take steps to stop it. And we don't know what kind of human misery is being experienced. It ought to make everybody here angry. But it makes me angry that 108,000 Americans died last year of drug overdoses, including 71,000 from synthetic opioids from precursors shipped from China to Mexico and that come across the border. And the cartels know if you flood the border with children, with asylum seekers and others, that Border Patrol will be overwhelmed. And so here comes the drugs, 108,000. And the chairman mentioned DACA, the Deferred Action on Childhood Arrivals. These are young people who came as children, who are now adults, and here we are 10 years later. There's not been one single bill marked up here in the Judiciary Committee or moved across the floor that would provide them some stability. And they've been tied up in litigation and are currently in litigation in the Southern District of Texas. So while some people pay lip service to the need to do reforms to fix the problem, nothing is being done. Our friends on the Democratic side happen to control the committees, then the agenda. Senator Schumer decides what bills are introduced in the Senate as a whole and marked up and voted on the floor. We need to do better than this. We must do better than this. We must show that we care about the fate of these children by doing our jobs. And we're not doing it so far.
Thank you, Senator Cornyn. I'd like to make a couple points, if I might. The hearing today is an effort to learn more from experts in the field on what we're facing, but it is not the last hearing by any means. I have invited Senator Cornyn and Senator Graham to join Senator Padilla and myself and to send letters to the agencies which Senator Cornyn has mentioned for specific documentary evidence as to what has happened, and particularly in the area of sponsorship and responsibility for these children. I would say that the Biden administration recently faced the end of Title 42, which many people thought would lead to a dramatic increase in people at the border. The opposite is the case, and when it comes to children, over the last 30 days since the lifting of Title 42, the average encounters of unaccompanied children have dropped by more than 50%. That's good news. It's not sufficient, but it's good. Move in the right direction. The solution for this problem facing America and many other countries is not to export these children, but it's rather to find a process that is orderly, that reduces the number who appear at the border on an unaccompanied basis, and reflects our values. So I think that's the ultimate goal we all should share, and I hope we can move toward that goal. I'm now going to introduce the
Mr. Chairman, may I just ask a question? Am I to understand that, and I appreciate it, that you've called this hearing, but that you expect to have other hearings where we'll have the government officials responsible for administering these programs as witnesses?
That's my intention, Senator Cornyn.
Thank you for
But
doing that.
I think bringing these folks in to speak to us, followed by the documentary evidence which we're asking for from the administration, is the proper way to approach this. And I'd be glad to work with you in that regard. We'll continue to have annual oversight by this committee of the relevant agencies that are under our jurisdiction. But when it comes to ORR and HHS, that is ordinarily outside our jurisdiction, but I think under the rubric of immigration law, that we certainly can pursue that.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just, forgive me for responding, but it feels like we're trying to leverage the welfare of these unaccompanied children for a larger immigration bill that you and I have been talking about for decades and have been unsuccessful in getting accomplished. I just think it's unfair to these children to leverage their fate on some unrelated immigration legislation, just as I feel like it's unfair to the DACA recipients who are awaiting some congressional action while they've been languishing in court for the last 10 years. So that's what it feels like, is we're saying we can't do anything in this area until we deal with unrelated immigration issues. Am I misconstruing what you're saying?
Yes, you are. I haven't said that, and I don't intend that at all. We want to move on this problem because of the urgency involving vulnerable and unaccompanied children, period. Do I believe that the solution to this problem is comprehensive immigration reform? Yes. You know that it passed in the Senate years ago because of a bipartisan effort, and I hope we can return to that spirit. But no, I will not pin the fates of these children or DACA on some comprehensive package. I'm prepared to deal with any and all of them on an immediate basis if we have some understanding as to what can pass this committee and ultimately be successful on the floor of the Senate.
Well, you know, Mr. Chairman, you and I have been talking about this for, at my count, 20 years,
And,
nothing has happened.
well, you've got to start voting for an immigration bill if you believe in them.
Well,
And
congratulations, they got it through the Senate, but it didn't
Well,
pass the House, it wasn't signed into law, so what have we accomplished?
Well, I wish you would have supported it. It would have been helpful. It was a bipartisan effort, and it passed the United States Senate. I'm looking for a bill that will win at least 60 votes on the floor. I hope we have that same ambition and goal. At this point, I want to introduce the panel of witnesses. I'll welcome the Democratic witnesses and then turn to Senator Cornyn for the Republican witnesses. Our first witness is Venus Bradley. She has a personal story to tell us. She's fostered 5 unaccompanied non-citizen children and is adopting 2 sisters who came to the U.S. from Central America. Then we have Lori Davidson, serving as Vice President for Children and Family Services at Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. Our final majority witness is Terry Gersten, Director of the State and Local Law Enforcement Project at the Harvard Law School Center for Labor and a Just Economy, a Senior Fellow at the Economic Policy Institute. Senator Cornyn?
Lori Reese is the Director of the Border Security and Immigration Center at the Heritage Foundation. She has over 26 years' experience in the immigration and Homeland Security arena and has worked for the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, and the House Judiciary Committee, Subcommittee on Immigration and Claims. She received her JD as well as her BA from Valparaiso University in Indiana. Ann Basham is the founder and chair of the Interparliamentary Task Force on Human Trafficking and the CEO of Ascend Consulting, a human rights advocacy firm. She previously served as a senior advisor for the Department of Justice Office of Victims of Crime, where she helped develop strategies for more than $2 billion in federal funding to address human trafficking, terrorism, sexual assault, and child abuse. She earned her master's degree from the University of Virginia. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cornyn. After the witnesses take the oath, they'll each have 5 minutes to speak and then 5 minutes questioning from each senator in the committee. I'd ask the witnesses to please rise. Please raise your right hand. Do you affirm the testimony you're about to give before the committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? The record reflect that the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Ms. Bradley, you're first.
Thank you. My name is Venus Bradley. My husband and I have been foster parents in Durham, North Carolina for the past 7 years. In that time, we have taken in 25 children, ranging in age from 2 to 17. 5 of them have been immigrant children. In March 2020, we were placed with 2 sisters who were 15 and 17 at the time. I would like to share a little bit about their story, and with their permission, of course. When they were 11 and 13, it was decided that they were going to be sent to America to come live with their father. Their mother was a palm oil plantation worker. She worked long days, and she had her first baby at 14 years old. She knew the life that her children were going to have, and she was worried about their future. Their uncle was in the military, and he was beheaded. They knew who did it, and they were told that if they went to the police, they would be killed too. So their mom made the difficult decision to have a trusted relative take them on the long journey to the Mexican border. There, they were taken into custody. They were first taken to a detention center. They were immediately separated because one was a teenager, so she was put in a different room. And the younger one describes how she just cried for hours, along with a lot of other kids who cried long into the night. She says it was really cold. They were just given these little aluminum blankets and not much information. They didn't know what was going on, and they were there for 2 weeks. Eventually, they were moved to a children's home, which was a little better. There were other kids there. There was school. They got to watch movies. But there were also a lot of rumors, and the girls met kids who had been there for 2 or 3 years. And so they were very concerned about what was going to happen. They were very scared. And they also were still separated. They weren't allowed to sleep in the same room or anything like that. So there was still a lot of fears there. After 6 weeks, which was a short time, they were eventually moved to their father, and that relationship was fine for a while, but eventually turned sour, and they reported abuse, and they were taken into foster care, and when no safe relatives could be found, they were moved to us in foster care. When they came to us, they were very traumatized. They didn't trust adults. They had a lot of fear. The youngest had nightmares nightly. She had to take sleep aids to go to sleep. The oldest was very parentified, which means that she tried to be a mom to her little sister, but didn't have any of the emotional skills to do it. And they really struggled in the beginning. And we tried to help them as much as we could with therapy, but it took a while before they were willing to trust and start dreaming of a future for themselves. We're going to fast forward now. My oldest is 20. She just graduated with a cosmetology degree. She's passed her state boards. She's already got 2 job offers. My youngest just graduated high school on Monday. She's been accepted into a 4-year college. She's going to major in business, and she wants to go into real estate, I think. And before you think that that's a happy ending, my girls still have a lot of obstacles that are in their way. Besides the employment authorization documents that we have struggled to get and maintain, and we also have a huge visa backlog. I was told it would take 3 to 8 years for my girls to get their green cards, and that's after they've applied, which they did a 1.5 years ago. And so we are waiting, and they are eligible for nothing. They are not eligible for FAFSA. They're not eligible for student loans, scholarships, or even foster care finances. And that's been a real struggle for us, trying to find them services and ways for them to grow and for them to actually be, proud members of society, to be able to work. And eventually they hope to have their citizenships. They want to be American citizens. They're lucky, they have us, but there's a lot of kids in the system who they don't get anything. And then they have people who aren't supporting them, and they're not getting any services to help provide for them, and they're struggling. So my takeaway is that these are kids. They're just kids. They have dreams and hopes for the future. And like my daughters, they deserve and need support and care in order to achieve their dreams. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bradley. Ms. Reese?
Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Cornyn, Senators.
Sorry, we can't hear you.
Thank you for inviting me to testify today on how we can ensure the safety and well-being of unaccompanied children. The historic border crisis our country is currently facing isn't only harming American communities and the integrity of our system, but migrants themselves, especially children, many of whom arrive unaccompanied. Let's face it, this is a crisis within a crisis. And it began in 2008 with passage of the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, or TVPRA, a law that hasn't lived up to its name. If we really want to ensure the safety and well-being of these vulnerable children, we must be honest about what caused the crisis and how to end it. What started in the mid-1980s as the Flores class action lawsuit about immigration detention conditions for alien minors and to whom such minors may be released has turned into a multi-billion-dollar legal regime that encourages unaccompanied minors to come on a treacherous journey to the U.S., requires the federal government to release them into the custody of sponsors who too often end up abusing or trafficking them, and according to DHS's Enforcement Lifecycle Report, results in 94% of them remaining in the U.S. Alejandro Mayorkas said repeatedly at the beginning and throughout his tenure as Secretary of Homeland Security that he would not send back unaccompanied minors. What did that tell parents, teenagers, and smugglers seeking to line their pockets? That this administration was opening the door wide open for unaccompanied minors to enter and stay in the U.S. And the parents, teens, and smugglers around the world heard it loud and clear. A historic 366,000 unaccompanied minors have been encountered just on the southwest border so far under the Biden administration. For those who closely follow border security, border data is tracked month by month. Yet after 28 months of record entry of unaccompanied minors, the Biden administration has not changed its policies to prevent such minors from coming here. Instead, the administration's response has been, get them in faster. HHS Secretary Xavier Becerra was quoted by the New York Times complaining to staff about delays in releasing unaccompanied minors into the country, saying, quote, if Henry Ford had seen this in his plants, he would have never become famous and rich. This is not the way you do an assembly line, unquote. Secretary Mayorkas has likewise pushed for speedier processing of illegal aliens, including minors, into the U.S. In his joint proposed rule, Circumvention of Lawful Pathways, Secretary Mayorkas admits that the objective of the CBP-1 mobile application appointment scheme is for CBP, quote, to process more individuals than would otherwise be possible, unquote. Like the border crisis itself, this administration's handling of unaccompanied minors is intentional. And beyond the historically high numbers, the results have been disastrous for the children involved and for Americans. Unaccompanied children are regularly raped and exploited on their journey to the U.S., and their lives, sadly, do not improve once they enter the U.S. They are turned over to questionable, if not dangerous, sponsors, forced to work in unsafe conditions that violate child labor laws, go missing by HHS, and are sex trafficked. Furthermore, MS-13 and other gang members, who are often teenagers, easily enter the U.S. as unaccompanied minors. Too many Americans and migrants have needlessly died at the hands of vicious gang members who were released into our communities. The Biden administration has also recently made the nonsensical decision to stop using DNA testing of suspected fake families at the border. The results are very predictable. A return to more child smuggling, child recycling, and trafficking. Say you're a family, and we'll take your word for it. Both the title and intent of Section 235 of TVPRA is, quote, enhancing efforts to combat the trafficking of children, unquote. And yet, from the historic volume of unaccompanied minors enticed by the law, the careless release of these minors to inadequately vetted sponsors, and the multi-billion-dollar windfall in profits this administration's open border policies have given the cartels, it is clear this administration is only creating more abuse, exploitation, and human trafficking. Section 235 of the TVPRA and the Flores court interpretation are abject failures. Instead of exploring ways to accommodate the current flow of unaccompanied children, Congress should accept that laws and judicial orders have resulted in terrible consequences, and it should replace them with a rational and effective system to prevent the unlawful and dangerous flow of unaccompanied minors into the U.S. Thank you.
Ms. Davidson?
Thank you, Chairman Durbin and Ranking Member Graham and members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to appear before you
Pull the
today.
microphone just a little bit closer. Appreciate it.
My name is Lori Davidson, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker and the Vice President for Children and Family Services at Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. LIRS is a faith-based organization that has been serving refugees and immigrants for over 80 years, including unaccompanied children from all over the world.
I'm sorry, you've got to get the microphone directly in front of you there.
Okay, sorry about that. Is that better?
Yes.
There we go. Okay.
There we go.
Excellent. Children separated from their parents are among the most vulnerable populations, and when they arrive in the U.S., they frequently have limited support and significant difficulty accessing services in their communities. This is a result of language and cultural barriers and unfamiliarity with U.S. laws designed to protect children, such as labor laws and mandatory schooling. While considerable progress to safeguard UC has been made through legislation such as TVPRA, it is imperative that we provide additional safety measures both prior to and following the release of unaccompanied children to a sponsor. The custody of unaccompanied children falls within the purview of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is a part of Health and Human Services. ORR is required to care for unaccompanied children until they are reunified with a sponsor. Prior to the release of unaccompanied children, ORR requires that potential sponsors complete a family reunification process, which includes various types of background checks, depending on the relationship of the minor and the proposed sponsor. Over the last decade, ORR has frequently changed the requirements for complying with background checks. Following the influx of 2014, where images of children under Mylar blankets flooded the news, ORR rolled back policies around background checks. The following year, Senators Portman and McCaskill held a hearing very similar to the one we're here today. By 2017, ORR stated that ORR started requiring all categories of sponsors and household members to undergo extensive background checks. But when the census became too high and children were being held on military bases, ORR began rolling back background check protections. 2021 brought additional changes in ORR's policies related to background checks, with the intention of releasing children to sponsors quickly. ORR adopted field guidance, which expedited releases and removed some background checks for certain categories of sponsors. During this period, cases of child labor exploitation were exposed in meatpacking plants. The recent cases of child labor highlighted by the New York Times echo the 2014 Ohio egg farm case. We must learn from our past mistakes. Rolling back background checks in times of influx cannot continue to be the solution to move children out of influx care facilities. ORR must consistently and appropriately vet sponsors based on their relationship to the child 100% of the time. LIRS recognizes that even when sponsors are thoroughly vetted, children may still find themselves in unsafe and exploitative situations. To mitigate these concerns, all children must be provided with access to in-person post-release services immediately following their unification with a sponsor. LIRS applauds ORR's efforts to expand the home study and post-release program. Unfortunately, there are over 18,000 children who are waiting for home study post-release services, some of whom have been on the wait list since 2021. Post-release services are a highly effective way to mitigate the risk of exploitation and ensure the safety of children. But to do so, they must be implemented immediately following release, and they must involve in-person visits. Additionally, UC need access to ongoing legal services post-release. All unaccompanied children are in removal proceedings, yet most do not have access to legal counsel. This makes it very difficult for them to comply with their immigration case. Attorneys are also often the only trusted adult relationship that an unaccompanied child has, and the only individual to help them understand their rights and to really understand if they are being exploited. Not only do attorneys screen children for protection cases, but they also assist in creating a repatriation plan if it's determined that it's safe for the child to return to their country. I believe that all children have a right to protection and that they're best cared for by their families. To ensure the safety and well-being of unaccompanied children in our communities, Congress must focus on improving protections and ensuring adequate resources to make sure that all unaccompanied children receive in-person post-release services immediately following their release, and that they have access to ongoing legal representation to safeguard against labor and other types of exploitation. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Basham?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Graham, and all members of the committee. It is an honor to testify before you today, and in this hearing, we have the opportunity to discuss one of the most important human rights issues facing our country right now, and that is the safety and well-being of unaccompanied children. To put this to you plainly, in March of this year, more than 12,000 unaccompanied children crossed the U.S. border, and this number has remained relatively consistent month after month. Many of these children were between the ages of 11 and 15, the prime age targeted by sex trafficking. I am a mother of 2 teenage girls squarely within this age range, and I am especially distraught at the thought of the physical and sexual violence, human degradation, hunger, thirst that many of these children have experienced en route to the United States. And sadly, this is a prelude to the violence that many experience once they are in the U.S., when promises of a better life are shattered and many are sold repeatedly for sex and forced labor. To address the root, though, I believe it is important to first understand who is crossing the southern border. And I know this was touched on earlier by Chairman Durbin, and I appreciate it. 47% of unaccompanied children were apprehended in the United States come from Guatemala, while an additional 40% come from Honduras and El Salvador. Last year, I was invited to speak at the Guatemalan Congress on the intersection between human trafficking and transnational crime. I have met Guatemala's President Giammattei, and Guatemala's Secretary Against Sexual Violence, Sandy Recinos, is a colleague and a member of the International Human Trafficking Task Force that I lead. In February of last year, Guatemala passed a law which increased prison sentences for human smugglers from 2 to 5 years to 10 to 30 years. Guatemalan leadership clearly do not want their children to leave their country with smugglers, nor do they want their children to face the unspeakable violence that often awaits them on the journey to and after arrival in the United States. Prior to arriving in the United States, these children and their parents are frequently in remote regions of Central American countries, which are impoverished and somewhat isolated because of language barriers, which is not something that's often talked about. For example, Guatemala alone has 24 different dialects. This means that it's difficult to communicate with parents the incredible risks that their children face if they leave in search of a better life. Coyotes are in a business, and they often trick or coerce mothers into paying children's hefty smuggling fees. And the mothers do this because they believe that a better life awaits their children in the United States. Unfortunately, for many children, this is simply not the case. Human trafficking is big business. And unlike other human rights abuses, it is a transnational organized crime, and it is the second largest criminal enterprise in the world. It is only surpassed by drug trafficking. It generates more than $150 billion annually for traffickers, and it actually funds every nation and movement that is currently threatening the security of our world today. And that is why there is a critical intersection between human trafficking and illicit finance networks. For example, to put this globally, the Taliban particularly support their operations through the opium trade, and sex trafficking is a key component of their funding apparatus. Unlike drugs or weapons, however, a person can be sold over and over again. MS-13, one of the most notorious gangs operating in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, the 3 countries I mentioned, they operate similarly. In 2015, the U.S. Treasury Department found that money generated by local MS-13 cliques engaged in sex trafficking, drug trafficking, murder for hire, extortion, money laundering, and I'm going to quote the U.S. Treasury Department, consolidated and funneled to the group's leadership in Central America. All of these factors contribute to a heightened risk of human trafficking, especially for children. Many of the Latin American children sent across the border alone or with smugglers have been taken by organized criminals and the cartels. And what frequently follows, as we know and has been said here, is child sex trafficking or labor exploitation. We all know the story of the New York Times and the labor exploitation, but the Department of Homeland Security's HSI has been involved in the prosecution of sex trafficking cases involving children as young as 14 who were funneled across a human pipeline from Mexico to New York City. Other unaccompanied children enter the U.S. foster care system. And for children who have been raped, beaten, exploited, or starved on the long journey, this can be a very welcome transition. They are free from coyotes, they're shuttled through a version of the American life. But the U.S. foster care system is no sure haven. Certainly, many U.S. families open their doors, they do it with integrity and self-sacrifice. My own parents were actually foster parents, and I was a foster sibling. And I applaud people like Venus Bradley here today who give these vulnerable children loving homes. We need more like that. But what we know, and this is so important for everyone to hear, is that the U.S. foster care system is already overly burdened with the number of children in the system outpacing the number of available families to provide a safe home. And additional to that, we know that U.S.-born children in foster care are already the most vulnerable to trafficking. In fact, 60%, remember this, 60% of trafficking victims have been in the foster care system at one time. So increasing burdens on the foster care system also puts vulnerable children more firmly in the crosshairs of traffickers. So there's so much more I could say, but I know in 2015 that President Obama made an incredible statement, and he said to the people of Latin America, don't send your children unaccompanied. They may not make it. If more Central American parents knew the truth of what their children would experience, many would think again before relinquishing them into the hands of violent criminals. And so I want to close with this. Our country is divided on many issues, we know this. But on this, we can all agree. No child should be trafficked, and no child should be abused. And because of this, I'm very hopeful that there are creative, compassionate, and comprehensive solutions. And I thank you again, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Graham, and the rest of the committee for your time and attention to this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Basham. Ms. Kirsten?
Good morning, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Graham, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. To lay some initial groundwork, no one is against teenagers having jobs. What our child labor laws prohibit is work that is damaging to children in two ways. First, employers can't assign children to too many hours or to work at certain times of day, like the night shift, because of the harm to kids' education. Second, employers are not allowed to have children working on a set of hazardous occupations. These jobs were chosen based on injury and fatality data, and they're among the most dangerous jobs for adults, so even more so for children who are at higher risk of workplace injuries. As we've heard, we're currently experiencing a serious upsurge in child labor violations. The Federal Labor Department reports a 69% increase in violations in the last 5 years, and of course, there's been extensive media reporting on this as well. These cases affect children who are immigrants and also children born here. Some cases involve companies we all know. Chipotle, for example, paid over $9 million for child labor violations in Massachusetts and New Jersey. Other cases involve processing of products many of us eat every day, like Cheerios. In Alabama, teenagers were working on manufacturing auto parts for a Hyundai supplier. In the most striking case, the Federal Labor Department found over 100 minors in several states working the night shift at meat packing plants operated by large meat companies like JBS and Cargill. The children were working for a sanitation contractor, PSSI, that cleans the plants at night. Children were cleaning the conveyor belt and meat processing machines, for example. Some had chemical burns, some were missing classes or falling asleep in school. This work was performed at the facilities of some of the biggest meat corporations in the world. All children are vulnerable at work, but immigrant children, as we've heard, are at heightened risk. They face language barriers, have uncertain legal status, limited access to resources, and they don't know U.S. laws or their workplace rights. As a result, too many have ended up in workplaces that knowingly flout our child labor laws. Economists have posited that unethical employers' compliance with the law is a function of two things: the likelihood of detection and the gravity of potential consequences. Our current system is inadequate on both fronts. 3 changes would help. First, the Labor Department needs far more resources. The Wage and Hour Division enforces our child labor laws, as well as minimum wage and a bucket of other statutes. The division currently has around 800 investigators to cover all of those laws in the entire country. That's about 165 million workers and around 11 million workplaces covered by these laws, and we have only 800 investigators to do this work. These staffing numbers are eye-poppingly low. They're also historically low relative to prior decades, even though the economy has massively grown throughout the decades. Second, we need to hold lead corporations responsible for violations in their supply chains. When these cases come to light, large corporations deflect responsibility and point to contractors, subcontractors, suppliers, and staffing agencies. Major corporations have the power to prevent violations. They can set contractual standards in their supply chains, monitor subcontractors, and make it clear they will stop working with anyone who violates child labor laws. They can also bring jobs in-house. If we really want to stop the exploitation of children, we need legal accountability at the top of the chain. This would mean strict liability for child labor violations in a supply chain, or at the very least, strict liability for repeat or widespread violations. It would also mean the government refusing to contract with lead corporations that have oppressive child labor in their supply chains. Third, we need stronger penalties. There are currently bills in Congress proposing this, which should be passed. But even very high penalties won't do enough if employers think they'll never be caught and if lead corporations never face consequences. This hearing is about ensuring the safety and well-being of unaccompanied children. The problem of oppressive child labor stems from unscrupulous employers violating the law. If employers didn't hire children for too many hours or assign them to do dangerous work, our child labor crisis would not exist. I believe we can do better. When teenagers go to work, migrants or US-born, we can and must keep them safe. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony. It's a cliche on this side of the table to say that our immigration system is broken. But when you hear the testimony of these 5 witnesses, you can't reach any other conclusion. From one end of the table to the other, you have given us a litany of failings of our current immigration laws. And sadly, most of those failings that you've talked about really relate to innocent and vulnerable young people who were caught up in a circumstance that was not their choice and whose lives are at stake in the process many times over. That is the reality. Ms. Bradley, thank you, you and your family, for reaching out to help so many others. The 2 daughters that you've adopted, can both of them now legally work in the United States?
They can. Thanks to our Congresswoman, we were able to push through their employment authorization cards so that they didn't expire. So they are both eligible to work full. Yeah, one of them has a job. She's worked for 2 years. And the other one is able to work at a salon as soon as she signs the contract. So yes.
As you mentioned, they do not qualify for many government programs that other children may be eligible for. At this point, do you see them, let me ask you, what is their immigration status at this moment?
At this point, they have a special immigration juvenile status, which they got when they came into foster care. It was approved by a judge, and they applied for their green cards in December 2021, and we told we just have to wait 3 to 8 years for that to come.
I hope
that's
it's
their
only
current
8
status.
years.
Yeah.
Ms. Davidson, you talked about attorneys representing these young people and said they don't all have legal counsel. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Do they have any representation at all?
So sadly, most children do not, and we want to make sure that kids have access.
Get closer to the
Yeah,
microphone.
sorry.
That you appreciate.
Most children do not have legal counsel, and it's so important because it helps them comply with their immigration case, but it also gives them that trusted adult relationship to make sure that they have someone that they can talk to if they're concerned about their rights.
What about the phenomena that I've heard described where it's difficult to have a sponsor or even a member of the family to step forward because they're worried because of their own immigration status of identifying themselves to the government to unite with the children? Have you run into that situation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, particularly under the last administration, when it was made clear that sponsor information would be used against them in immigration enforcement. So it is really difficult for sponsors to come forward. And we want these kids to comply with their immigration case because that's what they're guaranteed a right to have their case heard before a judge.
Ms. Basham, this sexual trafficking and sexual abuse that takes place, I mentioned earlier that I met with some of the migrants that were sent to Chicago from Texas when the governor decided to send them up, and sat down with them for several hours to talk about their experiences. There were no children involved in this interview process, at least of an age that they could tell me much. But I do recall a young woman who was about 30 years old who could have sat at this panel and looked like she was at home. She was a college graduate who made that trip to the U.S.-Mexican border, and she clearly was raped in the process. So the worst case, obviously, is child sexploitation, but it happens, obviously, at many different levels, and yet they still make the journey, knowing that danger lies ahead. I couldn't agree with you more that we have to find a way to educate, as President Obama tried with his statement, the families in these other countries about the dangers if they try to make this journey. What more do you think we could do at this point?
So that's a question that takes a lot more than 40 seconds to answer, but I'll tell you one of the things that's currently in Congress that will help right now is, I know TVPA is controversial, but there's a portion of the Frederick Douglass Trafficking Victims Protection Act that should be introduced shortly, and it deals with prevention education. And I will tell you that if when it comes to human trafficking, the biggest gap is in victim identification. Less than 1% of victims are ever identified, and if in general we had more prevention education and more children were able to come forward themselves and self-identify, if more teachers were able to identify, we would see a dramatic results throughout the country. So I think that's one legislative fix that's actually currently going to be in Congress shortly.
Thank you very much. Senator Cornyn?
Thank you to all the witnesses for being here today and sharing your perspective. I'd like to start with you, Ms. Basham. You've talked about the scourge, what I would call the evil of human trafficking. And you described the transit or the path of many of the victims of human trafficking from their home country up to the border. And then, of course, we've talked a little bit about how many of these children are unaccounted for now once they've been placed with sponsors in the country. Do you consider the status quo compassionate or humane?
So I can't speak to current immigration. I'm not going to speak today to current immigration policy, but I will tell you that currently in the United States, there are far too many children who are falling through the cracks. That is very obvious. That's something we can all agree with. So I think there are absolutely, when it comes to compassionate responses, the most compassionate is to make sure that every child has a loving family. And very clearly, most of the children coming, or a lot of the children coming across the border, it's a nightmarish experience, to put it mildly. And that's where I'll leave it with that.
Well, I wonder, why would we expect any different outcome when the people who are mainly in charge of immigration policy in this country are the transnational criminal organizations that get rich smuggling people from their home country, perhaps across the border into the United States. This is a huge money-making proposition. As someone pointed out to me years ago, the cartels are really commodity agnostic, and I found that to be a strange way to describe it. But basically, they said they don't care about smuggling people or money, anything that's going to make them money, or drugs, I should have said. They don't care whether they're smuggling people or drugs or anything else, weapons for that matter. all they care about is the money. And Ms. Reese, I know you've spent a lot of time looking at the current policies, but I would wonder if you could talk a little more about what you see as the consequences of the current policy with regard to the welfare of these children once they are placed with sponsors, and the fact that there are no follow-on services that are routinely available. In fact, the administration doesn't even know where these children are. Could you talk about the welfare of the child or these children?
Yes, in addition to the journey being horrific, as has been described by many, conditions are not necessarily better once they're here. And due to the volume of unaccompanied children among the volume of other illegal aliens coming to the U.S., HHS is releasing them very quickly. They've lowered their standards for vetting, and so some dangerous sponsors are taking them in, and we are seeing that HHS is not able to make contact with many of these unaccompanied children. 85,000 is a number that has been cited. And if it is their responsibility for the care of these children, at the very least, it is key that enough information is shared and followed up on by HHS, by ORR. But what you have to go upstream, and what is causing this is the very strong pull factors for unaccompanied minors to either be sent here or come on their own. If in the case of some older teens, if you turn off that magnet, you resolve a lot of these downstream effects.
So you mentioned the pull factors, which is what the Border Patrol has routinely told me. And of course, coming from Texas with a 1,200-mile common border, I've spent a lot of time along the border talking to the people who deal with this public health and safety crisis, this humanitarian crisis on a regular basis. But they talk in terms of the push factors, which are things like violence and poverty. We all understand why those would push people to take this risky avenue of submitting themselves to criminal organizations to be smuggled into another country. But talk a little more about the pull factors. These are things that the current policy does to actually make it easier for the cartels to smuggle people into the United States, and actually it tells people, in effect, that we've got the welcome mat out, so please come.
Right. When the border has been thrown open, when Secretary Mayorkas has said we will not return unaccompanied minors, when whether minors or family units are then released into the communities of the U.S., those are the strongest pull factors for more illegal immigration. The president, the vice president, the secretary can tell people don't come, but it is the results that are the strongest pull factor. When people south of the border learn that their friend, their family member got into the U.S., went to their location of choice in the U.S., is able to work, et cetera, that's the strongest message that goes back to both the cartels, the smugglers, and then more future illegal aliens.
Thank you.
Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you very much. Ms. Gerstein, there are right now states around the country attempting to weaken child labor protections. What do those efforts to weaken child labor protections portend for unaccompanied children?
So yes, those are very disturbing developments. 14 states have had bills proposing to weaken child labor laws in the last couple of years. 2 states have already passed laws weakening child labor laws, Arkansas and Iowa. These laws are going to put kids at risk. More kids are going to be in dangerous work. Iowa, for example, in certain circumstances, is going to allow children to be working in hazardous occupations that are prohibited by federal law. And this isn't just a question of cutting red tape. It's going to result in kids actually being in workplaces that are truly dangerous for them. I would note also that in Iowa, the Fair Labor Standards Act, our federal law, is a floor, and all employers have to follow that. And so in Iowa, passing a law like this actually puts employers in a bad situation because it can be very confusing to them. They could be following the state law and find themselves facing federal penalties. So the entire trend is the opposite of what we need right now, both for U.S.-born kids, for immigrant kids, and unaccompanied minors.
And speaking of federal child labor violations, how well can major companies insulate themselves from accountability for persistent child labor violations through the use of subcontractors and staffing agencies?
Many major corporations do insulate themselves from responsibility or try to deflect responsibility through using subcontractors, suppliers, staffing agencies, and more. Our labor law, the Fair Labor Standards Act, the definition of employee is to suffer or permit to work, which is extremely broad and really should include these circumstances. But the case law has developed in a way that makes it very hard to go up the chain and find a corporation to be a joint employer. That is something that should be fixed. There should be strict liability, as I said, either in regard to supply chains in general or certainly for repeat or widespread violations.
Thank you. Ms. Davidson, as I understand it, unaccompanied children don't have a right in immigration proceedings to have legal counsel appointed, and they don't even have a right to have a guardian ad litem. I don't think there's a courtroom in the country where a minor would be put in the position of having to represent themselves without even a guardian ad litem. Is that a defensible situation? Should we try to repair that? How big of a problem is this problem of a lone child having to defend him or herself in an immigration proceeding?
Yeah, most children do not have legal representation. Most unaccompanied children are trying to navigate this process on their own with language barriers and cultural barriers. And so giving access to legal counsel for children post-release is critical. All of these children are in removal proceedings. We want them all to comply with their immigration case. And to do that, they need to have someone who's helping them to navigate that process so they can stay in compliance, and the judge can determine whether or not they have a right to stay.
It strikes me, having spent a fair amount of time in the law, that whether you're in family court or whether you're in a civil proceeding or whether you're in juvenile proceedings, minors don't appear in those matters without either legal representation or a guardian ad litem or both. And I'm wondering if you can think of any other proceedings in which children appear without benefit of either legal representation or a guardian.
I do not know of any other circumstances in which a 3-year-old would have to represent themselves in court. It is indefensible.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thanks, Chairman.
Senator Tillis?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. And Mr. Chair, I understand that you and Senator Cornyn agree that we will be hearing from the administration at a future hearing and getting the data. I think that that's very, very important if we want to solve a complex problem. The subject that we're discussing today is one part of it's really not that difficult policy proposition, but for the politics. But when I hear people on either end of the political spectrum here blame one administration or another, the only thing that I believe is absolutely true is for about the last 40 years, there have been bipartisan failures under Republican administrations. We can point back to 1986 with Reagan's decision to provide amnesty. That created some of the pressures on the border. And each of the administrations I've observed, they've all failed. We haven't solved the problem. When you get into this, the reason why it's so important for us to get data is we've got to understand and come up with a common understanding of the problem. If we have child labor, if we have any person working because they're essentially forced to, the person who made the decision to hire them should be subject to criminal penalties and fines. Just simply that's simple. Let's talk about policies that do that. But then let's also talk about the reality that 80% of the people who come to the United States and claim asylum are ultimately adjudicated as not having a credible fear claim. So how many of these children were carried across the border, were subjected to the kinds of atrocities that I have firsthand accounts of, being down at the border several times, because someone made a decision to come to this country, put their children at risk, and not have a valid, credible fear claim? What about the families that leave one country, transit to a safe third country, and instead of choosing to apply for asylum there, then risk their child's life and limb by crossing the Rio Grande River? Every single person crossing the border now, if they want a good chance of surviving, have to pay a toll to the transnational criminal organizations. It was estimated that a year and a half ago, transnational criminal organizations were making $800 million a year in human trafficking. I fully believe that many of these children who find themselves having to work is in part having to pay the toll that they had to pay to get across the border. Depending upon the country, that can range anywhere from about $5,000 to $50,000. So the reason that we wanted a hearing is to baseline each and every one of the challenges that we're confronted with and address them separately. I personally believe that a parent who chooses to subject their children to all of the risks that come from transiting the southern border should be held accountable. If, in fact, they had an opportunity to go to a safe third country, get them out of what I will stipulate was a dangerous situation in their country of origin. But why on earth would you not try and take the safest path to get here legally? Why on earth wouldn't you stop in a safe third country and say, I have a difficult, dangerous situation in my country, I have documentation to prove it, and I'm applying for asylum? What's wrong with that? So sooner or later, we have to talk about the reality that parents are making bad decisions in the thousands. 80%, folks, 80% of the people who apply for asylum are adjudicated by Democrat, Independent, and Republican judges as not having a valid, credible fear claim. That's a big number. So we have to start looking at this and teasing through it and then getting to immigration policies at work. Most people know that I've been on every bipartisan effort to try and get immigration reform, border security done since I've been in Congress the last 9 years. But then we talk past ourselves. We say, well, if we just have guest worker programs. What we don't talk about is how labor unions want to artificially increase the rates to the point to where you just won't have those jobs in the United States. And they could be living wage jobs. But that dirty little secret from the left never gets brought up, but it's real, and we can point to proposals where that's a problem. But I'll tell you who's watching this hearing probably more than anybody else. It's the cartels. When you grow an enterprise to $800 million a year, you can get pretty sophisticated. And we're letting the cartels play us like a piano by talking past each other and not coming up with sustainable, smart solutions to immigration reform, humanitarian accommodations for the families who are truly at risk and the children, and all of these other things that we could be working on. But my guess is in this hearing, we'll talk past each other quite a bit, and we're at risk of going another 4 or 5 years if we don't get this right in this Congress without any solution at all. And the kids suffer, Border Patrol agents will die, 100,000 people will die of fentanyl overdoses, and we'll be so close, but people do not have the political courage to step up and solve this problem. That's on us. It's not on you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Senator Tillis. Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I referenced in my opening remarks, there's significant reporting just in the last several months alone by NBC News and the New York Times calling our attention to the labor violations found by the Department of Labor, migrant children being exploited for their labor. So in response to the reporting, I actually partnered with Senator Hickenlooper to send letters to 27 CEOs, CEOs of the major companies accused of the wrongdoing in that most recent round of reporting. Our letter demanded that it take immediate steps to stop the ill treatment of children. And according to the findings and the reporting, migrant children have reportedly been working in unsafe conditions, in hazardous conditions, and in other unlawful circumstances. We ask the CEOs to carefully examine their hiring procedures. We ask them to examine their workplace safety policies. And we ask them to review their compliance with wage and hour laws to prevent any further exploitation of children, and to share with us their assessments. Now, their responses were, how should I say this, overwhelmingly lackluster, often filled with finger pointing. Not our fault, it's a subcontractor issue. Not our fault, it's a subsidiary issue. Anything but actually taking accountability. One would think that the Fair Labor Standards Act would protect all children from labor exploitation at all levels of the supply chain, but there's clearly a breakdown. My first question is for Ms. Gerstein. Can you explain the challenges that exist in enforcing child labor protections at all levels of the supply chain, and what would you encourage Congress to do to ensure that children are better protected?
So you're absolutely right. The lead corporations do point a finger and deflect responsibility to suppliers and subcontractors and staffing agencies. The Fair Labor Standards Act defines employee very broadly, but case law treats it very narrowly and makes it very hard to get accountability up the supply chain. What is needed, the challenges in enforcing child labor protections, one is the funding limitations on the Federal Department of Labor. They're grossly underfunded relative to the need. Another challenge is the difficulty in going up the supply chain. These cases also are very resource intensive and difficult to enforce. If you look at the Federal Department of Labor's PSSI case, it was an investigation that involved they found over 100 minors working at multiple states. They did surveillance and warrants and multi-team investigator investigations and interviewing many reluctant witnesses. These cases are hard to do, and the Department of Labor really needs the resources to do them effectively. In terms of liability up the supply chain, strict liability for for the lead corporations for violations in their supply chain, or at least strict liability when there are repeat or widespread violations, and also government contracting. The government can use its contracting abilities to not do business with lead corporations that have these violations in their supply chains.
Thank you. Now, on a different note, I do want to tell my Republican colleagues that there is actually an agreement. It's undeniable that we need to crack down on dangerous cartels and traffickers who exploit children. It's absolutely necessary. However, we must also recognize that parents and relatives who flee persecution should not be treated as criminals merely for trying to keep their children alive. Implementing policies, as the last administration did, that aims to criminalize these individuals inevitably leads to family separations, inflicting harm upon children, leaving them even more susceptible to exploitation. Policies such as the Title 42 public health order, right? It was a public health order, not an immigration law, which denied adults the chance to seek asylum, often left parents facing an agonizing choice. They were forced to decide between either staying with their children and risking continued persecution for the entire family, or providing at least their children with an opportunity for stability and safety. So this policy created a dilemma that had profound consequences for many families, often leading to the heart-wrenching decisions and the exacerbation of vulnerabilities. Ms. Davidson, you testified that the continuous application of the Homeland Security Act of 2002, the TVPRA, and Flores is critically important to protecting kids from exploitation. Can you explain why a break in procedure is proven to be so harmful?
Yeah, absolutely. When we're talking about these protections, this is the bare minimum. We're talking about things like giving a child access to food and water and to be held in humane conditions. And if we were to roll back any of those protections and not look at children in terms of their best interest, and to make sure that they are in the least restrictive setting, that they're unified with their sponsor quickly, if we roll those back, we are putting children in grave danger. We saw over half a dozen children die in CBP custody under the Trump administration. And so we really have to prioritize these protections and make sure that they are in place for unaccompanied children.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Senator Padilla. Senator Hawley?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad we're having this hearing. And thank you to all of the witnesses. Thank you for being here. I want to visit with you in just a second, but I just want to reiterate something that I heard the chairman say that I agree with, which is that there really ought to be government witnesses sitting there. And I tell you what I'm tired of. I've had Secretary Mayorkas sit in front of me in a different committee, the Homeland Security Committee, where I asked him at length about the outrage of 250,000 migrant children, unaccompanied, crossing the border in the last 2 years, and tens of thousands of them being sold into slavery. Let's not mince words. They've been sold into slavery. When kids are being put into factories, forced to work overnight, forced to work in terrible conditions, they're not getting paid, they're not going to school, sometimes they're not getting fed, that's slavery. And what I heard from Secretary Mayorkas, don't take my word for it, you go look at the record, read the transcript. What he told me was, oh, it's not my problem. We don't have anything to do with it. Not my problem. Now we have a new report from HHS where they say it's not their problem. Amazing how this works. Nobody's responsible. These kids are literally being sold as slaves in the United States of America in the year 2023, and nobody's responsible. They don't want to come and testify to this committee. You bet they don't. They don't want to be put under oath. They don't want to answer any questions. They don't want cameras here. They don't want to take any responsibility. Well, I tell you, it's somebody's fault. It's not the kids' fault. Thank God for the New York Times, phrase I never thought would come out of my mouth. But really, I mean, thank the Lord that the New York Times did these series of reports, because otherwise we'd still be fed the lies from this administration that everything is fine and dandy. We know just where the kids are. It's all great. They're all fine. No, it's not. Is it fine that people like Carolina Yuck, who's 15 years old, I apologize to her if I mispronounced her name, she's one of the folks, one of the young women that the New York Times caught up with. What is she doing? Midnight in Grand Rapids, Michigan, a conveyor belt carrying bags of Cheerios past a cluster of young workers. Carolina, every 10 seconds, has to stuff a sealed plastic bag of cereal into a passing yellow carton. It's dangerous work, fast-moving pulleys and gears that had torn off fingers and ripped open a woman's scalp. The factory was full of underage workers like Carolina who'd crossed the southern border by themselves, vulnerable, now spending late nights bent over hazardous machinery in violation of child labor laws. Carolina says, sometimes I get tired and feel sick. Her stomach often hurt. She was unsure if that was because of the lack of sleep, the stress from the incessant roar of the machines, or the worries she had for herself and her family in Guatemala. This is totally, utterly, completely unacceptable. And I am sick unto death of this administration coming before this Congress and saying, it's not our fault, we have nothing to do with it, we don't know where they are, the kids are fine, somebody will do it, somebody will get around to it. Ridiculous. Let's look at some of the things that we've learned about what's going on over at HHS that Secretary Becerra is doing. Here's some quotes from employees at HHS. At least 5 Health and Human Services staff members said that they were pushed out after raising concerns about child safety. This is all from the New York Times, by the way. Mr. Becerra told the Office of Refugee Resettlement Director that if she could not increase the number of discharges of children, he'd find somebody who would. Next, 20% of kids have to be released every week or you get dinged. It's a conveyor belt of children being forced through the system. And what's the priority of HHS? Just get them out as fast as we can. They go to factories. They go to slave labor. I've written to the FBI and asked the FBI, where are the 80,000 plus children this administration's lost? They don't know. I've said it's your responsibility to go get them. It's a direct violation of child labor laws. They're not doing anything. Nobody's doing anything. It's outrageous. It's absolutely outrageous. And the fact that the administration won't come and sit there and answer questions to this committee is absurd. And it is nothing more than cowardice. They don't want to answer questions. They don't want to be responsible. They don't want to take responsibility for this. So let the record reflect that this administration has let tens of thousands of children be sold into slavery, and they are doing nothing about it. And I hope, Mr. Chairman, I'm glad you said that we would be holding additional hearings. We need to have additional hearings. There need to be administration witnesses there, and we need to figure out what in the world is going on and who's to be held accountable for this. Because I tell you what's not an acceptable answer. It's not acceptable to say, it's not my problem. We wish the kids the best. The kids are in danger. The kids are in slavery. The kids are being exploited. And it should not happen in the United States of America. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding this hearing, and I, too, am glad that we're going to have others, because I'm hoping that we'll have bipartisan support not only for enforcement of prohibitions against exploiting child labor, but also perhaps for comprehensive immigration reform. As Senator Tillis said, we need to confront the broken system that currently is our immigration legal apparatus. Not only stronger border security, a faster, more reliable asylum process, visas for people who will have jobs that are vitally needed here, and a path to citizenship for our dreamers, but also enforcement of labor law violations now on the books. And I want to ask you, Ms. Gerstein, thank you for your very extensive report in your testimony. What kind of grade would you give federal law enforcement of our child labor prohibitions under OSHA?
Well, the child labor prohibitions are located within the Fair Labor Standards Act, and the Wage and Hour Division has responsibility for enforcing them, but obviously OSHA enforces workplace safety and health. I think they're doing a very good job given the extremely limited resources that they have been provided. Our federal labor agencies have been starved for funding for decades. They have not been supported in a way that is necessary to help them do their jobs. In the meantime, the economy has grown tremendously. We also have the rise, for example, of forced arbitration that prevents people from being able to bring cases in court and adds greater pressure to public agencies. The decline of union density. Unions help make people more able to report violations because there's less fear of retaliation. And so with all of this added pressure, the growth of the economy, the labor agencies are just really, really underfunded. Under the current acting labor secretary, Julie Su, and there are so many civil servants and people within the Labor Department who are really doing the best that they can and being strategic. The PSSI case was really, really well investigated and well done, but they're not given the tools and the resources they need to do their job effectively.
To put it very simply, our enforcement mechanisms are being starved.
Absolutely.
And they were under the previous administration. In fact, the number of OSHA inspectors under President Trump fell to the lowest number in 45 years, correct?
Yes, and the Wage and Hour Division, for example, had 400 more inspectors in the late 70s than we have now. And one expert did some calculations and found that if you look at the number of investigators to workplaces, that Wage and Hour at its inception in the 1930s had 64 times as many investigators per workplace as it does now.
And having been a prosecutor, I think we have a number of prosecutors on the committee, deterrence depends on enforcement. Respect for the law depends on reliable and effective apprehension and prosecution. It also depends on penalties. Right now, the maximum penalty, I think, is $15,000 for violating the child labor laws. Is that correct?
Yes, it's a little over 15,000.
And would you agree that increasing the penalties would also have a strong effect in deterring these kinds of violations and protecting children?
I think it's critical that we increase the penalties. I think that alone will be inadequate unless funding is also increased and unless we find a way to hold lead corporations responsible and accountable.
So I invite my Republican colleagues who speak vociferously and vehemently on this topic to join the Child Labor Prevention Act, which would increase the maximum fines for violations and establish new criminal penalties. Now we're talking criminal penalties for child labor and hold employers accountable. There's also the Child Labor Exploitation and Accountability Act, which is sponsored by our colleague, Senator Booker. I am a co-sponsor of these measures, but unless we take these kinds of practical steps, resources, penalties, more effective enforcement, we can make all the speeches we want. We can use all the rhetoric we please, but it won't have an effect on employers who exploit children because for them, it's all about the money. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Since the senator from Missouri is still here, there are 2 points I'd like to make about that he mentioned testimony. We did not invite representatives of HHS or DHS to this hearing today. We did not today. What we have done with these expert witnesses is have the first hearing. We are having a document production. I invited Senator Graham, Senator Cornyn to join, Senator Padilla and myself for documentation to follow forward. On the 85,000 sponsors or children that are unaccounted for, it is my understanding that after they have identified, ORR has identified a sponsor, and the children are placed with that sponsor, the follow-up to find out how they are doing is a very poor one, in my estimation. It's a series of telephone calls, 3 telephone calls to the sponsor. And if they have not answered after the 3rd call, they're listed as not being reached. We had testimony here from witnesses that these young people have no legal representation necessarily. And so it's up to the sponsor to link up with ORR, and it's not happening, which I think is a deficiency in the system that's very obvious. I think Senator Ossoff is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to associate myself with Senator Blumenthal's remarks.
Excuse me, Senator Ossoff, I've made a grievous error.
Wow, we'll get through this together, Mr. Chairman.
Senator,
It's all right. No, sorry.
Senator Graham is next. I'm sorry.
I'll be brief. Senator Hawley, we do need to have the administration here, and hopefully we will. So let's see if we can find some common ground here. Of all the witnesses, how many of you agree with the following statement, that the system is broken and needs to be fixed? Who thinks the system is working? Let's do it the other way. Raise your hand. Well, nobody raised their hand. So bottom line is, I think it's broken, and I'd like to fix it. Now, how do you fix it? You punish people who exploit children as one fix. You change your policy so it's not so incentivized to have unaccompanied minors come. Ms. Gersten, is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Why do you think there's been a 300+% increase in unaccompanied minors coming to the border since 2020?
I'm not here to talk about that today. My expertise is in labor
Fair
law
enough.
enforcement.
Fair enough. Ms. Basham, can you give us an answer to that question?
Well, I don't know for certain, but I will tell you this, that it's probably a combination of factors. And I do know when it comes to human trafficking in general, we can talk about all sorts of things, but the root cause is actually the criminals themselves. And so when we talk about push factors and pull factors, those have to be addressed because at the end of the day, it's a crime of luring. So they are luring the mothers to oftentimes hand over their children, and they don't really know what's ahead of them. So I know Chairman Durbin spoke of, a terrible testimony that you'd heard in Chicago, and I do not believe that many of those who are coming know what lies ahead. That's first. And I also believe that the root is actually the criminals themselves. And so, as I think Senator Tillis said earlier, you know, this is really a crime where we are dealing with they're making money off the sale of people. They could be making money off the sale of drugs. They could be making money off the sale of weapons, but they're making money off the sale of people. And so you have to deal
Is the
with that.
Taliban involved in this, you mentioned?
So the Taliban, I don't believe, I have no evidence of that directly with this, but I will tell you that sex trafficking itself is a huge money-making operation for every single terrorist network in the world. So whether we're dealing with ISIS or we're dealing with Boko Haram in West Africa, whether we're dealing with what I would call adversarial nations, they all use versions of human trafficking to fund their operations, all of them.
So, Mr. Chairman, there are 3 countries, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, that make up the vast majority of unaccompanied minors. So I would recommend that we have the ambassadors of those countries come and talk to the committee. We don't have to do it publicly, but privately, and see if we can find some kind of agreement with the countries to do more on their end. I'm willing to help them do more. I'm certainly willing to punish them if they don't. So seems to me that one of the reasons you have so many more coming is that the narrative is if you get an unaccompanied child to the United States, chances are they're not going to be sent back to these 3 countries. We need to change our policy and treat these 3 countries, and really all countries, as if they were Canada and Mexico. This non-contiguous policy is incentivizing this. And the money to be made, Ms. Basham, we'll go back to you. The average unaccompanied minor doesn't just leave the house and walk to America. Somebody guides them through, is that correct?
Correct. Correct.
And who are these somebodies?
Smugglers.
Smugglers.
Coyotes.
So there is a criminal enterprise built around unaccompanied minors, and we know what countries are the biggest offenders. So why don't we start, Ms. Chairman, with trying to find some agreement with these countries to deal with this problem, and I'm willing to do incentives, carrot sticks. Maybe that help can't hurt. When it comes to stopping the problem, you're going to need immigration reform. And I'm hoping we can find some foothold on immigration reform. But the explosion in numbers, 300-something% increase in 2 years, there's a way to stop it if you want to and slow it back down and get the numbers down. And Mr. Chairman, that's going to require a policy change. This administration has to come to grips with the fact that their policies are failing miserably in this area. Thank you.
I'll sign up for that meeting with the ambassadors. That's a good idea. Now let's try Senator Ossoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing. Thank you to the panelists for your hard work and for lending your expertise to the Senate. I think for all Americans, and particularly for parents, it's just heart-wrenching to hear, to know what so many children are going through, who are in such vulnerable positions and let down at every stage along the way. So I just want to actually just open this up and ask each of you to make one recommendation to Congress that you think is practical and achievable right now to reduce the suffering of vulnerable children who are entering our country unaccompanied. Beginning with you, please, Ms. Gerstein.
Adequately fund labor enforcement and create up-chain liability. I know that's 2, but I said it quickly.
Ms. Basham.
I think increasing victim identification, specifically through education widespread throughout the school systems.
Ms. Davidson.
Need to adequately resource post-release services and legal services to make sure children are protected.
Ms. Reese?
Secure the border to prevent the flow.
Ms. Bradley?
I would repeat what Ms. Davidson said as well, that being able to make sure that the children are protected after they've been released to their sponsors would be good.
Thank you, Ms. Bradley. And Ms. Davidson, I've co-sponsored Senator Hirono's bill, the Fair Day in Court for Kids Act, to ensure that unaccompanied minors do have representation as they move through the adjudication process. Can you explain to the committee how a lack of legal representation impacts an unaccompanied child who is moving through adjudication or detention or the ORR system, please?
Absolutely. So unaccompanied children are some of the most vulnerable children. Most of these kids don't speak English. They don't have a strong understanding of how the immigration system works, yet they are in removal proceedings. And so it's imperative that these children have legal counsel so that they have their day in court, that they're able to share their story, and then a judge is going to determine whether or not they qualify for relief. And without that attorney, I mean, it's just ludicrous to think of small children having to represent themselves in immigration court. And so making sure we have resources for legal services for children post-release is critical.
Ms. Davidson, I want to talk about the unaccompanied children who end up in foster care. And quite a number do wind up in foster care for some period of time. Senator Blackburn and I have launched an inquiry focused on the abuse and neglect of children in foster care in the United States. What sort of process, in your view, Ms. Davidson, should we undertake to ensure that unaccompanied minors who wind up in foster care systems don't suffer abuse or neglect or wind up lost to the system?
Yeah, I think first we want to work on preventative measures. So making sure that children and family have the supports that they need so that we can care for them without having to put children into foster care unnecessarily. But children in foster care need to be protected. And we need to make sure that local child protective services understand some of the additional vulnerabilities of unaccompanied children, such as the fact that they have no legal immigration status. And once we have really provided additional training for CPS to understand the needs of these children, I think we protect them because we want children to feel like they have that trusted adult, somebody that they can tell if they're worried about abuse or neglect.
Thank you, Ms. Davidson. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm so pleased that Senator Ossoff mentioned the work that we're doing looking at foster care. I think that's going to be important to making certain that children are properly cared for. Mr. Chairman, I know that you and Senator Hawley discussed the fact that we have no government representative here today.
I mentioned they were not. I mentioned they were not invited.
I think that if my understanding was that there was a choice not to invite someone. The point is Secretary Becerra needs to come before us. I've got a letter I sent to him on April 27th. It was after a hearing at the Finance Committee where he could not give me an answer of what has happened to 85,000 children. 85,000 unaccompanied children. HHS is responsible for them, and they can't find them. They don't know if they're dead or alive or trafficked or being worked because they can't find them. The Office of Refugee Resettlement has lost about a third of the children that they're supposed to be caring for. I think this is shameful. I have not received a response from the Secretary on what has happened to 85,000 children. I will ask to put my letter in the record because he has had this time. The point is they don't know where these children are and they cannot find them and they're not doing anything about it. I think that it is shameful and we need to call him before this committee and find out what has happened with these 85,000 children that they cannot find. Ms. Rees, I want to come to you. You mentioned the southern border. as something that could be done to stem this. I've been on the border several times. I see exactly what you're talking about. And it is why last week I introduced the End Child Trafficking Now Act. It would require a DNA test to establish familial relationship. This is something that had been put in place under the Trump administration, but like most Trump-era border policies, the Biden administration chose to end that. It is a 45-minute test. It tells you if a child is related to a person or not. It would put a stop to much of this child recycling, which is disgusting. And I would just like for you to speak for a moment about why it is so critical for the CBP to establish that familial relationship right there at that border with that adult and that child standing in front of them.
Because we have seen in the past, and we will soon see again, an increase in fake families. The cartels respond to border operations. And if CBP is going to stop taking DNA tests when they suspect a fake family, or if they have seen this child again with a different adult before, then they're going to send more fake families through, which means more suffering of kids, more trafficking, and more terrible results. So it was a bad decision, and they really need to reverse course and continue to test. When the agents who have developed expertise on this suspect fake families, they should be testing them.
And the numbers that I have seen are as many as 30% of the children being presented as a family member at the border are being trafficked. Does that match up with the numbers that you have?
There have been several that have been discovered. So it is effective, and for any family, any child, that can be saved from smugglers and adults who are lying and claiming that this child is theirs with obviously ill intent, then that is well worth it.
One of the things that I had noticed as I was preparing for this hearing, Secretary Becerra pressured the Office of Refugee Resettlement to speed up sponsor transfers for unaccompanied alien children, going so far as to say, and I'm quoting him, if Henry Ford had seen this in his plants, he would have never become famous and rich. This is not how you do an assembly line. Now, Secretary Becerra's comment is repulsive, but I think it's also revealing. It confirms what we already know, that Secretary Becerra has no regard for what happens to these children that are released into the country. So I would just like to, well, and I'm over time. Ms. Reese, I'm going to ask you just to send in writing to me how you perceive Secretary Becerra's attitude. What does it do to harm the system and to make children less safe?
I will do that. And just to follow up on your DNA question, one statistic. Between April and June of 2019, ICE was able to identify approximately 275 fraudulent families in just a matter of a couple months.
Thank you.
Thank you. On behalf of the chair and for clarification for the record, DHS does conduct DNA testing and continues to when there's a question about the validity of a parent-child relationship, and additional scrutiny is placed on individuals who are not related to the child to ensure that a child is not being trafficked. Chair recognizes Senator Booker.
Mr. Chairman, I think, and let's see for the record, I think that policy was ended on May 31st.
We're giving the
and
most
they're
current,
relying on documents.
the chair's providing the most current information. We can continue the discussion after. Senator Booker.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I want to thank all the witnesses. I think there's been valuable perspective given on all components of this problem, from what's happening at the border all the way to U.S. labor laws. I also have been sitting here and have some appreciation for colleagues of mine on both sides of the aisle who don't see this as a political blame game, but are trying to find constructive solutions to this problem. It's the only way we're going to deal with it. This is clearly a deplorable reality in any country, this violation of human rights and the exploitation of children. But to have it happen in the United States is so shameful and so outrageous. It should inspire the best of all of us to look to real constructive solutions. And it is so outrageous that this continues to happen year after year in the United States of America. There are children being exploited by companies and others who are absolutely deplorable. Let me get to my hopefully constructive questions. Earlier this year, I introduced the Child Labor Exploitation Accountability Act, which would hold corporations accountable for the exploitation of children and workers by simply saying that frequent violators, repeat violators of worker safety laws shouldn't be eligible for federal contracts paid for with taxpayer dollars. I think that if someone does this once, it should have real significant penalties. These are rational economic entities. If they know they were going to pay a severe price for it, then you would see it less happening. And so this is a legislation that, in my opinion, would increase penalties that would change behavior. Monetary penalties or debarment is important to address child labor laws. Ms. Gerstein, would you agree, just really simply?
Yes, I agree. Government contracting should support good, high-quality jobs, and at the very least, jobs that are legally compliant, not companies that are violating child labor laws.
Right. And the acting chairman, who's an extraordinary friend of mine, the United Farm Workers asked 100 senators to go out and work a day in the fields. He and I went out and actually did it, some of the hardest work of my life. And just talking with the women I was working with and hearing their stories of sexual harassment, of wage theft, that alone shouldn't go on. But when you talk about child labor, one of the things that seems to me needed is funding for the Department of Labor. That just having the resources to do their work, as the acting chairman sort of whispered to me earlier. Could you just comment on that for a moment?
Yes, the Federal Department of Labor is grossly underfunded. The Wage and Hour Division has record low numbers of investigators. OSHA as well is at very low numbers. There's some statistics about how each workplace at current OSHA staffing levels would be investigated every 150 years or so. The Solicitor of Labor's office doesn't have enough resources either. I'm really encouraged to hear a lot of concern by the members today about the exploitation of child workers, but if we really want to address this, we need to fund the agencies that are charged with enforcing our laws.
I mean, that's common sense to me, that this is a functional way to enforce the law. I think there's bipartisan agreement on having resources for border enforcement. I think there's bipartisan agreement when it comes to our local police departments to keep us safe. But the people who are enforcing the law for labor, the people that should be out there doing a better job stopping this exploitation, don't have the resources they need. The final point that I have is that there are consequences for industries, and I want to focus in this last question on industry, the meatpacking industry, which is more concentrated today, more corporate concentration than it was when Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle and exposed the horrific practices that were going on. You are now seeing in that industry horrific practices and labor violations, including child labor. And I'm wondering if you think your commentary on, I'm seeing some move towards unionization, which there was far more. It used to be a middle-class job to be working in these things. Now it is a job where you see immigrants and exploitation. Is there any hope that that union organizing that's starting to go on can offer any antidote to what's happening?
Well, there's tremendous support for unions among Americans. In surveys, 50% of workers say they would join a union if they could. 70% of people surveyed say they have a positive impression of unions, and yet only 6% or so of private sector workers are actually unionized. And that's because our federal labor law, the National Labor Relations Act, is really outdated and needs to be updated. At the same time, unions really do offer a better job and better jobs and opportunities to people. They raise standards when they're present in an industry, not just for members, but also throughout the entire industry. And one interesting, in relation to meatpacking, one interesting development after the Department of Labor's PSSI case is that JBS created JBS Sanitation and took some of these jobs, instead of outsourcing to a subcontractor, to the contractor, PSSI, took some of these jobs in-house and has an agreement with UFCW, and now these are going to be good union jobs instead of jobs that are being done by exploited young immigrant children.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Every day, the disaster on our southern border continues to get worse. This disaster is a true humanitarian crisis, and it is the result of deliberate political decisions by Joe Biden and Kamala Harris that have inflicted unspeakable horrors on millions of illegal immigrants. 6.6 million illegal immigrants have crossed illegally into this country since Joe Biden became president. And it is, in particular, done enormous damage to children. We're here today because the Biden administration has utterly failed. It has failed to secure the border, and it has encouraged parents to send their minor alien children on a dangerous trip to the United States unaccompanied. And it's failed to protect these children after they were let into the United States. The Democrats running this committee have also failed, as we're holding a hearing to discuss the issues facing HHS's placement of unaccompanied minors. But we don't even have a single official from HHS here to answer our questions. Javier Becerra should be sitting right in the middle of this panel, under oath, being forced to answer difficult questions about his absolute dereliction of duty when it comes to caring for these kids. But the Democrat leadership of this committee doesn't want Secretary Becerra to face those hard questions because it would reveal his utter negligence and the children who are being harmed as a result. And so the absence of HHS is not an accident. It's not an omission they just forgot. It's a deliberate decision. Let's protect the Biden administration from accountability. And concomitant with that decision is a decision to say the children being harmed are not important enough to the Democrat senators on this committee to overcome their partisan desire to play politics and protect the Biden administration from the consequences of their own failure. Take a look at this image. This image was captured from a video shot in El Paso on March 24th, 2023. Where a smuggler abandons a 1-year-old child, a Guatemalan boy, on the riverbank. This 1-year-old child has now entered the unaccompanied minor alien child system currently administered by the Biden Health and Human Services. According to the Department of Health and Human Services, approximately 127,000 unaccompanied minors entered the United States during fiscal year 2022. So 1 year, 127,000 kids, all alone. 2021, again, according to HHS, 107,686 unaccompanied minors entered the United States. Compare that to the last year of the Trump presidency, where that number was approximately 30,000. A 7-year low. Now, let me be clear, even one child in the custody of human traffickers is horrific and wrong. But 127,000? This administration, no wonder Secretary Becerra is too scared to sit there. He should be embarrassed of that record. Health and Human Services received $7.8 billion last year just for unaccompanied minor children. Troublingly, on February 24, 2022, HHS admitted in a letter to Representative Andy Biggs that it could not contact approximately 20,000 minor children it placed in 2021. In 1 year, 20,000, it just lost them. No wonder Secretary Becerra is not sitting at that table. On March 22, 2023, Senator James Lankford pressed Secretary Becerra on a portion of the New York Times expose indicating that HHS had failed to account for 85,000 previously placed alien children. Becerra disputed the question, saying it was unrealistic, but he failed to offer any concrete evidence or data or statistics. On April 25th of this year, I joined Senator Marco Rubio and my colleagues in a letter addressing HHS failures on this score, which actively highlighted the fact that the Biden administration loosened vetting, fired HHS staffers who filed complaints, and ignored HHS contracted organizations who voiced concerns. After the New York Times published a second expose, the administration announced the Department of Labor was taking action. What action? Action addressing child labor. Well, child labor is abhorrent, but how about the hundreds of thousands of children who are being smuggled in by human traffickers, who are being abused, who are being sexually abused, who are being physically abused, and whom the Biden administration has lost? This is a humanitarian crisis, and it is a man-made crisis produced by political decisions from this White House. And every American, whether Democrat or Republican, should be horrified at the state of affairs.
Thank you to the witnesses, members of the public who are here today, members of the committee who have participated in today's hearing. I do want to reiterate what Chairman Durbin announced a couple of times earlier in the hearing. And number one, that the document requests are into the administration for the additional information and data that's been discussed. Also, that there will be additional hearings on this topic in this committee, including one with government representatives. This is the first of, not the only hearing on this topic. And also on behalf of Senator Durbin, I want to thank the witnesses for participating here today. Now, one of the biggest concerns that I've had over the past several months, and again today, as I've listened to the testimony from our witnesses, is about accountability. Time and time again, I've seen a stunning lack of accountability and a willingness to pass the buck on something as outrageous as child labor exploitation. And let me be more precise. We're talking about billion-dollar companies, household names in America, who are more than happy to report and brag about their profits each and every year. Corporations who spend heavily on hiring consultants to analyze every step of their supply chain, their manufacturing process, make recommendations on how to eke out ever more efficiencies, productivity, and profit. Yet when it comes to responsibility of who's working for them, who's making these profits even possible, they claim ignorance. It's offensive that CEOs of these companies want us to believe that they don't know what's happening in their facilities or what's happening with suppliers or the contractors that they choose to employ. It's a shock to the conscience, and there's no longer room for ambiguity for who's at fault. As you heard from Ms. Gerstein today, employers across the nation indeed have the means to prevent this exploitation from happening. But all too often, their choice to look away has become more profitable, and those profits have become their priority. We must enforce the laws to hold these employers accountable and ensure that our federal agencies are working together to better protect these children, all children. And it's clear that we must work together to enact some of the reforms mentioned here today to do better for their sake. With that, I thank you all once again. This hearing is adjourned.